Picture this: a decision made in a London bank in 1837 would quietly determine whether hundreds of thousands of Americans would live or die in the bloodiest war their nation had ever seen. This is the story of how British bankers accidentally kept slavery alive, and how that one bailout made the Civil War inevitable. It's spring 1837 and fog blankets London. Inside the massive stone building of the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street, the governor and his directors are staring at their account books in complete shock. The numbers they're seeing spell out a disaster that seems impossible. And here's the crazy part: this panic didn't even start in London. The crisis began thousands of miles away, in the steamy cotton trading floors of New Orleans and the chaotic trading houses of New York. But just like a deadly disease spreading on trade ships, this financial collapse crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean, and now it's destroying London's economy. The whole disaster centered on three specific banks that everyone in the financial world called the 3Ws: Wiggins, Wilds, and Wilson. If you were just a regular person in London walking past their offices, you wouldn't think twice about these companies. They look like any other business, just fancy brass nameplates on heavy wooden doors. But if you were part of the financial elite who really understood how the global economy worked, you knew the truth. The 3Ws were the American houses. They were the financial lifeline connecting Britain's massive industrial wealth to the cotton fields in the American South. And now, they were completely bankrupt. The collapse of these three banks wasn't just about some accounting mistakes. It was the inevitable explosion of a 10-year financial madness that had completely changed how British money and American slavery worked together. These banks had committed the worst sin you can commit in high finance. They'd loaned money for the long term, but borrowed money for the short term, and they'd done it on an absolutely massive scale. For 10 whole years, they'd given basically unlimited credit to Southern plantation owners and American cotton dealers. They let plantation owners in Mississippi and Alabama buy more land and purchase more enslaved human beings to grow more cotton, all based on nothing but promises about future harvests. These banks accepted what were called bills of exchange as their guarantee. Think of these bills as fancy IOUs, promises to pay that were backed by cotton that hadn't even been picked yet. The American houses would put their prestigious stamps on these bills, magically turning risky debt from plantation owners into top-quality financial papers that could be sold in London's money markets to fuel the British Industrial Revolution. It was a perfect cycle that fed itself. British gold purchased American slaves. Those enslaved people picked the cotton. British factories in Lancashire turned that cotton into cloth, and the profits flowed back to London to pay off the original loans. But here's the thing: this entire system only worked if cotton prices stayed stable. In early 1837, that stability completely fell apart. Cotton prices crashed in global markets because there was too much supply and credit was getting tight. Suddenly, the Southern plantation owners couldn't pay what they owed. They defaulted on their bills in massive waves. The collateral that the 3Ws were holding, millions of pounds worth of American promises, became worthless in a single night. The 3Ws were left holding the bag for an entire region's economic failure. They owed enormous sums to other British banks and depositors, money they could no longer pay back. This created a moral and financial nightmare for the Bank of England, and the decision they made would shape America's future for the next 25 years. The bank's official job was to keep the pound sterling stable and make sure it could always be exchanged for gold. It wasn't supposed to prop up foreign farming bubbles or rescue reckless private gamblers. According to the free market rules of that time, the 3Ws should have been allowed to fail completely. Their bankruptcy was the direct result of their own greed and their reckless gambling on human slaves and unstable commodities. Letting them collapse would have been the natural market correction. Painful, yes, but necessary to clean out the bad debt. But there was a massive problem. The British banking system and the American South had become so deeply connected that you could uncut them apart without causing a complete disaster at home. The 3Ws owed about $5.5 million, an absolutely staggering amount in 1837, equivalent to a huge chunk of the Bank of England's own gold reserves. If these three companies collapsed, they wouldn't go down alone. They would trigger a chain reaction that would wipe out the financial companies holding their papers, the regional banks that depended on their cash flow, and eventually the textile factories in Manchester and Liverpool that needed their credit to buy raw materials. The slave-owning South had basically gotten itself so deep into the British financial system that it had become too big to fail. The British economy wasn't just buying Southern cotton anymore. It had become the main creditor of the Southern plantation system. When faced with the possibility of total system collapse, the Bank of England made a decision that would change history. They handled it very quietly to avoid letting the public know how bad things really were, but the bank decided to step in. They didn't let the market fix itself naturally. Instead, they opened up their vaults. The bank gave massive emergency credit lines to the 3Ws and other struggling American companies. They basically guaranteed the toxic debts of the Southern economy. This was a bailout in the modern sense, a transfer of risk from private gamblers to the central bank. By saving these banks, the Bank of England unknowingly saved the plantation economy of the American South at its most vulnerable moment. If the 3Ws had been liquidated in 1837, the credit lines to the Mississippi Valley would have been cut violently. Plantation owners would have been forced to sell their land and their enslaved workforce at bargain basement prices to pay their creditors. Slave prices would have crashed, destroying the wealth base of the Southern aristocracy. The expansion of the Cotton Kingdom into Texas and the West might have stopped 2 decades before the Civil War even started. The economic power of the slave-owning class would have been destroyed by the cold judgment of the free market. But that's not what happened. The bailout worked. The 3Ws were stabilized, and even though they would eventually be shut down or reorganized, the immediate flow of credit was restored. The panic died down, and the machinery of the cotton trade started running again. This secret rescue operation did way more than just balance London's books. It confirmed the Southern belief that King Cotton was invincible. It taught the plantation owners a dangerous and intoxicating lesson that the British economy depended so much on their product that London would always rescue them. It reinforced the arrogance that would later push them towards secession, firmly planting the idea that the Bank of England was their silent partner. They interpreted the bailout not as lucky timing, but as proof of their global power. The governor of the Bank of England only wanted to save London from a cash crisis. He had zero interest in American politics. But by doing so, he accidentally financed the survival and growth of slavery for another generation. The South did survive the chaos of the late 1830s because of its own money or its own strength. It survived because the Bank of England refused to let it die. To really understand how important this event was, you need to look at the specific tool that tied these two worlds together, the sterling bill of exchange. This was the financial instrument that made the entire Atlantic trade possible, and it was the same instrument that almost destroyed London. A bill of exchange wasn't actual money, it was what we'd call a derivative today. It was a contract that allowed a plantation owner to turn his crop into cash before it was even harvested. When a plantation owner in Alabama needed money to buy tools, seeds, or human beings, he would create a bill based on his agent in New Orleans. That agent would endorse it and send it to New York. The New York agent would send it to Liverpool. And eventually it would land on the desk of a company like Wiggins, Wilds, or Wilson in London. When the Bank of England bailed out the holders of these bills, they were essentially turning the future labor of enslaved people into money. They were agreeing to treat these paper promises as if they were as good as gold, just to keep British industry running. This decision locked in the vendor financing model of the cotton trade. It guaranteed that for the next 20 years, the South wouldn't need to develop its own advanced banking system, its own industries, or its own money reserves. They didn't need to. They had direct access to the deepest pool of capital in the world. As long as the cotton kept growing, the Bank of England would keep the money flowing. This dependency created a false confidence in the South, a belief that their economic system was strong, when in reality it was being artificially kept alive by decisions made in a boardroom in London. The Panic of 1837 is often taught as an American banking crisis caused by President Andrew Jackson's policies. But the truth is, it was the first real global financial crisis. And the way it was resolved laid the financial foundation for the bloodiest war in American history. To really understand why the Confederate States felt confident enough to declare war on an industrial superpower in 1861, you need to look past the angry speeches of politicians and examine the financial structure that the Bank of England's 1837 bailout had protected. The rescue didn't just save a few bankrupt banks. It locked in a system of vendor financing that turned human beings into financial products and tied the Southern economy to London with chains made of gold. The main tool of this system, and the source of the South's fatal overconfidence, was the sterling bill of exchange. This financial instrument was the lifeblood of the Atlantic economy. When a plantation owner in the Mississippi Delta wanted to expand his business, he rarely used his own cash. He didn't need to. Instead, he would draw a bill, basically writing a check against a crop that hadn't even been planted yet. This bill was a legal contract, promising to deliver a specific amount of cotton to a specific port at a specific time. The plantation owner would give this bill to a cotton agent in New Orleans or Charleston, who would accept it, adding his own creditworthiness to the note. This agent, backed by the credit of a London merchant bank like the survivors of the 3Ws, would endorse the note. Suddenly, a piece of paper representing cotton that was unplanted and labor that hadn't been purchased was transformed into premium sterling paper. It could be shipped to London and traded in the financial markets of Lombard Street as easily and safely as a British government bond. This financial magic meant that the British banking system was essentially turning money into the entire life cycle of the Southern economy. When a plantation owner bought an enslaved person at an auction in Charleston, the purchase was often funded by a credit note that was ultimately cashed in London. When that enslaved person cleared land, the tools were often paid for by British credit. And when the cotton was finally harvested, it was already mortgaged to a British company before a single boll was picked. The Bank of England, by keeping the discount window open for these American bills and saving the system in 1837, was basically acting as the central bank of the future Confederacy in everything but name. They provided the cash flow that allowed the South to operate without a developed domestic financial system. The South didn't need its own banks, its own gold reserves, or its own industrial capital because it had full access to London's. This deep structural dependence created a dangerous psychological problem among the Southern elite. Men like Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, and Judah P. Benjamin, his future Secretary of State, weren't economically ignorant provincial farmers. They were smart operators who understood global trade. They looked at the balance sheets of the British Empire and saw a terrifying dependency, not their dependency on Britain, but Britain's dependency on them. They saw that by the late 1850s, 20% of Britain's entire population depended directly or indirectly on the textile industry for their survival. They calculated that a break in the cotton supply wouldn't just cause a recession in Britain. It would cause mass starvation, social chaos, and potentially a revolution that would overthrow the monarchy. This belief was strengthened by the Panic of 1857, another severe financial crisis that shook the Atlantic world. Once again, the cotton trade was at the center of the storm, and once again, the British financial system took the hit to keep the mills running. To the Southern observer, this confirmed the bailout logic. They thought they had proof that the Bank of England and the British Parliament were their silent allies. They confused a bailout, a financial rescue designed to save British institutions, with an alliance, a political commitment to defend the South. They assumed that, because the Bank of England had saved them with money in 1837 and 1857, the British Royal Navy would save them with warships in 1861. They believed that if the North tried to blockade the southern ports, the financial pain in London would be so severe that the Bank of England would force the British government to step in, just to save the pound sterling. This delusion was so powerful that it drove the financing of the Civil War itself. Even after the shooting started at Fort Sumter, the Confederacy was able to sell bonds in the sophisticated markets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam. These were called cotton bonds, the most famous being the Erlanger loan. These bonds were unique because they could be converted into cotton at a pre-war price. The pricing of these bonds during the early years of the war is a fascinating case study in financial bias. For the first 2 years of the conflict, Confederate cotton bonds often traded at a higher value compared to Union government bonds in European markets. Smart European investors were buying the debt of a rebel government that didn't even have a recognized currency. Why? Because the City of London trusted the physical asset cotton more than the industrial promise of the North. The financiers believed the bailout logic still held. The world needs cotton, therefore the South cannot lose. They were betting their fortunes on the continuation of the 1837 arrangement. But the nature of the global economy had shifted in ways the South completely ignored. The Bank of England's 1837 bailout had scared the British establishment more than the Southerners realized. It had exposed the existential danger of being too dependent on a single volatile supplier across the ocean. In the quiet years between the Panic of 1837 and the outbreak of war in 1861, British strategists had begun quiet but determined diversification efforts. The Manchester School of Economists and the directors of the Bank of England started looking east. They began investing in infrastructure in India and Egypt, trying to turn these colonies into alternative sources of white gold. While the South was doubling down on slavery, convinced they had the Bank of England in a stranglehold, the bank was slowly hedging its bets. They were building railroads in Bombay and irrigation canals in the Nile Delta. The secret bailout of 1837 was a one-time emergency measure, not a permanent promise of support. The South's entire grand strategy was based on calling a bluff that the British had already abandoned. The Southern King Cotton diplomacy was basically a distressed asset sale disguised as a geopolitical strategy. They embargoed their own cotton, refusing to export it to Europe in 1861. It was a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. By holding back the cotton, they didn't squeeze the British as hard as they hoped. They accidentally helped them. The British mills had overstocked during the huge harvest years of 1859 and 1860. The warehouses in Liverpool were overflowing. The cotton famine didn't hit right away. By the time the shortage became serious, the Union Navy's blockade was working, and the British had activated their backup supply chains in India and Egypt. The financial lifeline that had fed the South for 30 years was breaking apart. The financial tragedy of the Confederacy was that they mistook debt for power. They thought that because they owed London millions, London was their servant. They believed in the idea that if you owe the bank a little, you're the bank's servant. But if you owe the bank a massive amount, you're the bank's master. In 1837, the debt was indeed the bank's problem, so they fixed it to save themselves. But by 1861, the bank had protected itself enough to let the borrower fail. The Southern plantation owners were playing a game of poker with a partner who had already left the table. The 3 W's were long gone, replaced by a more careful breed of banker who saw that the Confederacy was a bad investment, a risky venture, trying to turn money from a moral horror in an era where the world was moving toward ending slavery. The financial leverage that Jefferson Davis thought would bring the world to its knees turned out to be a suicide vest, and he was holding the trigger. When the moment of truth finally arrived in 1861, the check that the Confederate States of America tried to cash in London came back stamped insufficient funds. The diplomatic strategy of the Confederacy, King Cotton, was revealed to be not a brilliant piece of global leverage, but a miscalculation of suicidal proportions. The Southern leadership had bet their entire existence on the belief that a shortage of cotton would force the British Empire to step in, refusing to export their own cash crop in the early months of the war. They believed this famine would bring the British economy to a complete stop within weeks, forcing the Bank of England to demand a naval rescue to break the Union blockade. Instead, the embargo produced one of the most ironic outcomes in economic history. By holding back their cotton, the South didn't squeeze the British. They accidentally bailed them out again. The years leading up to the war, specifically 1859 and 1860, had seen record-breaking harvests of unprecedented size. The British textile mills weren't running low on cotton. They were drowning in it. Warehouses in Liverpool and Manchester were packed to the ceiling with extra bales. When the South voluntarily stopped shipping cotton, they'd basically solved the oversupply problem for the British merchants. The price of the inventory sitting in British warehouses shot up, creating massive windfall profits for the mill owners. The cotton famine didn't hit immediately. By the time the shortage became serious in late 1862, the Union Navy's blockade was effective, the strategic moment had passed, and the British had successfully activated their Plan B supply chains in India and Egypt. The turning point that sealed the financial doom of the South wasn't a battle but a document, the Emancipation Proclamation. Once the war became explicitly and undeniably about the institution of slavery, the Bank of England's secret support became politically toxic. The 1837 bailout had been a quiet boardroom deal managed by elites for elites. But by the 1860s, the political landscape of Britain had democratized. The British working class, the very men and women who worked in the mills, and were suffering most from the lack of cotton, took a position that completely shocked the Southern aristocrats. They sided with the Union, even as they starved and faced unemployment because of the closed mills. The workers of Lancashire held massive meetings declaring their solidarity with the enslaved people of the South. They refused to support a slave power, even if it meant their own economic hardship. This popular pressure made it impossible for the British government or the Bank of England to step in. A second bailout was politically impossible. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, read the mood of the voters and realized that any move to recognize or finance the Confederacy would bring down his government. The three W's were long gone, and the new generation of bankers in the City of London saw the writing on the wall. They realized that the Confederacy was a failing asset with no path to recovery. The credit lines were cut. The vendor financing model that had kept the South alive for 30 years was dismantled overnight. The Bank of England's refusal to execute a second bailout broke the back of the Southern war effort more effectively than any Union army. Without access to London's deep capital markets, the Confederacy was stripped of its ability to buy the weapons of war. They couldn't buy ironclad ships, they couldn't buy rifles, and they couldn't buy medicine in the quantities needed. Desperate for money, the Confederate government turned to the only tool they had left, the printing press. They started to issue their own paper currency, the grayback, backed by nothing but the promise of a victory that was slipping away. This led to a hyperinflation spiral that made the later Weimar Republic look stable by comparison. In 1861, a Confederate dollar could buy a decent meal. By 1863, it took a wheelbarrow full of them to buy a pair of boots. By 1864, the currency was virtually worthless. The inflation rate in the South hit 9,000%. The entire economy went back to a primitive barter system. Soldiers were deserting not because they were cowards, but because their paychecks couldn't buy enough food to feed their families back home. The cotton bonds that had traded at a premium in London crashed to zero. Sophisticated European investors who had bet on the South lost everything. The bonds became nothing more than expensive wallpaper, eventually found lining the walls of broke Southern homes as a grim reminder of the misplaced faith in King Cotton. The legacy of the 1837 bailout is a dark lesson in the relationship between finance and morality. For decades, the City of London acted as the money launderer for the profits of slavery. They didn't own the slaves, but they turned the whip into money. The cash flow provided by the Bank of England allowed the plantation system to survive its own inefficiencies and internal problems. It allowed a feudal farming society to project the power of a modern nation. It artificially propped up a system that the free market was trying to kill. If the Bank of England had let the South fail in 1837, the history of North America would have been completely different. Slavery might have withered away as an economically unworkable relic, a victim of bankruptcy rather than bullets. Instead, the bailout taught the South the wrong lesson. It taught them that they were indispensable. It fed the arrogance that led them to charge into a war they couldn't afford, believing that a check from London would always arrive to save them. When the dust settled in 1865, the South wasn't just defeated militarily, it was financially erased. The credit structures that had been carefully rebuilt after 1837 were completely destroyed. The British banks simply wrote off the bad debt, shrugged their shoulders, and moved their money elsewhere. They started financing railroads in the Argentine Pampas and tea plantations in Ceylon. They found new partners who didn't come with the political baggage of slavery based on owning human beings. The secret bailout of 1837 serves as the definitive proof that the Civil War wasn't just an American conflict, it was the violent unwinding of a toxic transatlantic financial partnership. The South believed they were too big to fail. They forgot that in the cold calculation of international finance, there is no loyalty, only cash flow. The Bank of England cared about the pound, not the plantation. And when the political cost of supporting the South outweighed the financial benefit, the City of London did what banks always do: they foreclosed. The Kingdom of Cotton didn't just fall, it was liquidated. The cause was, at its core, a bad loan that finally came due.